Hello, and welcome to the Early American Brass Band Podcast. I'm Chris Tryan. I'm joined always by Stephen Cannistraci.
Hello.
I haven't told you this, but my parents, they listen to the podcast, and they get a kick out of your hellos, just so you know.
Okay, well, I'll keep changing it up then if people like it.
Anyway, welcome to the Early American Brass Band Podcast. As we said, this is episode number 10, where we'll be talking with a good friend of ours, Barry Bocaner. Stephen and I both play with Barry, but Stephen, you play a little bit more regularly with Barry. What's your relationship with Mr. Bocaner?
Well, I met him. Well, you passed my information along to him when he was starting the brass band in Northern Virginia, which is a British-style brass band that he mentions in the episode. And they were looking for a second euphonium player, and I reached out, and they said, "Sure, come along." So I play second euphonium with that group, and so I sit right next to Barry. He plays first baritone.
Baritone, yeah.
Yep, first baritone. So I've gotten to know him, sitting next to him in rehearsals and concerts, and he's a great guy and a very interesting hobby of, we'll say, amassing instruments. As you'll see in the episode, he is not the hugest fan of the word collector, but yeah, he's got a bunch of period instruments, which he talks about in the episode, and really does a lot of research on these horns that he buys. And we had a great time talking to him and learning what he's learned about all of his instruments through museum trips and talking with instrument makers and whatnot.
And similar to Eric Totman's The Horn Collector episode, we'll be sure to include any pictures and links to some of the stranger instruments that Barry might be talking about in this episode. So for reference, be sure to go over to our website at eabbpodcast.com to the show notes section for this episode, and you can actually see what the heck we're talking about, because these things can look pretty weird. So go ahead and do that. But Stephen, what if one of our listeners really likes early American brass band music and they just can't find any CDs? They don't know any way of purchasing any of this type of music. Where could they go to find a rather extensive list about those?
Well, Chris, I'm glad you asked, because on our website, eabbpodcast.com, there's a tab in the main menu that says resources. One of those resources is a discography of early American brass band recordings. So you can go there, look at the discography page, and there will be information there as to the band, the album title, what the cover looks like, and a link to purchase it. So if you're looking for some new music to listen to while we're all stuck inside, you can go over there and find a bunch of links to buy some really great albums. And there are also some other resources there, lists of bands who are active, and a very long list of other links that might be interesting to articles, databases, some instrument collections, pretty much anything that might be remotely related. There are some links there.
Cool. And without further ado, here is episode number 10. Episode number 10. There's an R at the end of that word. Episode number 10 with Barry Bocaner. Enjoy. All right, welcome to the podcast, Barry Bocaner. Thank you so much for coming out this afternoon onto Zoom and speaking with us today.
Oh, thank you. I've been really enjoying the podcast.
Thank you. How are you doing
Thanks.
today? Quarantine treating you okay?
Yeah, I for the longest time I had kind of felt just a little depressed about the whole situation and hadn't picked up too many instruments and all that. And in the past couple weeks I've been, oh yeah, let's play. I like this. This is fun. So,
and in a way, it's like it's been good, like forced time off in a way, both physically and mentally. And now it's kind of like a rediscovery and reintroduction at this point. It's able to feel fresh to a certain extent. I know some people don't feel that way at all, but
well, I've got a lot of musical instruments here, and they don't always get a lot of attention. And now I'm realizing this is a good opportunity to pick up some of these less used instruments and get good at them and that sort of thing. So it's fun.
Cool. So I guess we can follow the formula that's been proving true with some of our other interviews so far, and kind of go a little bit more or less chronologically, if you don't mind. So starting relatively towards the beginning, can you kind of share some of your early musical background? And
Sure. So I grew up in kind of a musical household. My dad was in the National Symphony from 1960 to 2000 for 40 years.
Wow.
Played clarinet, and so I started on piano real early. That was kind of like, you're going to do this. And actually, one of those, the music world is such a small world. And Denny Edelbrock kind of hit it on the head last week when he was talking to you guys about how you're going to meet all the same people over and over again, and they're going to remember if you did a good job and were on time and all that.
Yeah.
So in one of those weird little coincidence things, my childhood piano teacher was Marjorie Lee, who was the accompanist on Dr. Bowman's album.
Oh, nice. On the Carnegie Hall one?
Well, that's what it's called now. When they reissued it on CD, they said the first Carnegie Hall euphonium recital, and they added a few tracks. But originally it was just called Brian Bowman Euphonium.
Oh, okay. Nice.
And
awesome.
And then I studied with Dr. Bowman later, so that's kind of one of those neat little things where everybody knows everybody, and it's kind of neat. Yeah. So I was very serious about piano from a very young age, and that was one of those piano studios where everybody had to do all the competitions and multiple recitals a year, and it was very high stress, and it wasn't for me. So around the time I was in second grade, I told my parents, I've had enough. I don't want to play piano anymore, which is a decision I totally regret now every time I sit at a piano and try to play something. Yeah. I had to accompany my daughter's Suzuki Book 3 cello recital a couple weeks ago, which we live streamed, and of course with everybody shut in, we couldn't get a piano accompanist to help her, so I had to do it. And that was, I've never practiced that hard in my life for Suzuki Book 3 piano accompaniments. So totally regret having quit piano. Kids out there, don't do it. Keep playing piano. But my parents said, well, you got to play something. That's non-negotiable. So I was like, all right, whatever. And a few weeks later, my dad came home with King baritone, your American euphonium, in the back of the car, and said, okay, here you go. And I got some lessons shortly after with Elliot Shasnov, who was a trombone player in the Air Force Band at the time. Now he's the trombone professor at University of Illinois, I think. Awesome guy, but got really good at that really fast and really enjoyed it. And then when he retired from the Air Force Band, I started taking lessons with John Hewling, who was the assistant principal trombone player in the National Symphony, colleague of my dad's, carpool partner of my dad's. Yeah. And I guess by the time I reached high school, I was really darn good at euphonium, and I kind of said to myself, I really like doing this. I want to do this professionally. And then I kind of sat back and thought, well, gee, career options for a euphonium player are, well, there's like, at the time there weren't so many soloists and people who made careers of just being a soloist. But I thought, I don't want to be a teacher. That's not me. And I don't want to be in the military. That's definitely not me. So I need to switch to trombone. Freshman year of high school, I switched to trombone. I wasn't really big in the high school band thing. I practiced a lot on my own. I played in the youth orchestras and stuff like that. High school band, I didn't even do it a few years. So concert band music was never really all that interesting to me, especially the stuff that you played in high school. So as a result, I never got great at either euphonium or trombone because I switched at the point that, I was really good for a ninth grader at euphonium. I had been studying with Dr. Bowman and, probably wasting most of the great advice he gave me. And then he moved to Pittsburgh and left the Air Force. And so I switched to trombone, and I never got to the point where I got really good at trombone, and I never got to the point where I got really good at euphonium either, because I didn't like spend that, undergrad years playing euphonium, trying to really make it amazing.
Yeah.
And so I did a few years in music school and realized, I'm having a lot of problems with my playing. I'm never going to be the kind of person that wins an audition for the New York Philharmonic and scraping together a living as in regional orchestras and stuff like that is a terrible life. I've seen, friends do that. And while a lot of them really, really love the music, it's hard to make a living doing that. And around the same time, I realized that I was actually really good with computers, and got a job running a small ISP. And that was, the early 1990s, where that was cutting edge stuff, and I started making money, and it was a lot of fun. And I realized that I really had a talent for doing this computer stuff and enjoyed it a lot, and it was great. So I didn't play any instruments for a few years, and what ended up happening was after a few years of only playing on Easter and that sort of thing, what I call every trombone player works day.
Yeah.
I started getting, some gigs playing in community orchestras and stuff like that. And, lo and behold, all those problems I had when I was in school, working really, really hard to try and solve them, had just sort of magically gone away on their own. And not having any stress of you got to be really good or else you're never going to get a job. That stress was ruining it for me, and just being able to enjoy it. I could spend a lot more time. I didn't resent practicing. It was fun. And then I hit upon the early music thing. The deal is, living in DC here, there are so many good euphonium and trombone players around, right? They're all here, especially euphonium. But in DC, as a pretty decent euphonium player, and I can hang. I'm pretty good, but I'm not like you guys. You guys are both amazing. Your listeners might not know this, but you guys are really amazing, both of you. And while I can get together with the people in the service bands and I don't sound out of place, I'm not in danger of winning an audition or anything like that. It's I just don't have the time to put in that level of practice and really get to that point. So what I figured out was that if you're the guy that has all the weird instruments that those people don't own, you can get some really good gigs just because you're the guy that's got the instrument. I guess my journey with early music and what today we call historically informed performance, HIP, is that when I was a kid, I discovered my dad's LP of that Gabriele album with the Chicago and Cleveland and Philadelphia brass sections. Everybody knows that. Everybody discovered that at some point when they were a young brass player and got really excited about it. And then, listened to the Empire brass version and the Canadian brass version. And they're awesome. The playing is just incredible. But I made the mistake of telling my dad, hey, go get me more Gabriele CDs. And he got me some that were played on original instruments. The Hesperian 20 had one that I had, and Gabriele Consort had one that I had. And when I listened to those, it was just completely different music. And I really got excited about that on those instruments. Not only just the instruments, but the way of playing those instruments and the style of playing those instruments. It was really special to me. And now, I can go back and I can listen to the Empire Brass recording, and it's fantastic playing, but it doesn't get me excited. And when I go back and I listen to a fantastic early music group like Concerto Palatino playing that same music, that is really, really exciting. And part of that is the fact that the modern instruments are designed to work in a giant orchestra, and they're not designed to work in a chamber setting like that, and they just don't have the sensitivity and the way the timbres work. It's very, very different. So I got really interested in that, and then I purchased at the time as a young professional, when I was just getting my career started, I couldn't afford really expensive instruments like fancy German or Swiss sackbuts. For those of you who don't know, a sackbut is basically a word. It's a word that they used back in the 17th and 16th centuries. But these days we kind of use sackbut to denote that this is an early trombone that we're talking about and not a modern trombone. So I couldn't afford a sackbut, so I went and got a cornetto. And there's a company called Christopher Monk Instruments in England that makes plastic cornettos. They're the company that kind of started making the first reproduction cornettos in the 20th century.
When were they producing those instruments? What time period was this kind of?
Well, they still make them, but I think they started doing those in the 1960s.
Oh, okay.
That's kind of when the whole rebirth of a lot of this early music happened.
I didn't know plastic brass instruments were being made that early on. I thought that was a relatively new thing that was being done.
Well, of course, a cornetto, as a friend of mine likes to say, is a platypus, right? So we're not talking about the cornet. We're talking about the cornetto, which is kind of like a recorder. It's made out of wood. It's covered in leather, and it's got finger holes like a recorder. The fingering system's a little bit differently because it doesn't overblow at the octave. It's kind of very acoustically messed up. But if you hear one of the people who are really great at playing them, they're amazing. So a plastic cornetto is closer to like a plastic clarinet in how it's built, rather than the way like a plastic trombone is made or a plastic trumpet is made. So this really doesn't have anything to do with American brass bands, but it was kind of my point of entry into the world of hip, you know. And I made the mistake of taking this plastic cornetto to orchestra rehearsal one day that I was going to be a little early for, and just pulled it out in the church and was playing a little bit. And the tuba player in the orchestra heard me, and the tuba player in the orchestra was Bob Planch. And I don't know if you guys know Bob Planch. He's kind of a central figure in the early American brass band because he was one of the first people who was doing repair work on these instruments and things like that.
He just recently retired, I think, from instrument repair, right?
Yeah. So Bob, amazing guy, super nice guy, was actually my dad's seatmate in the Army Field Band in the 1950s on their tour bus. Nice. So before my dad was in the NSO, he was in the field band, and then I think Bob went into the Pershing Zone after he was in the field band, and was a fantastic tuba player, and also subbed with the NSO a lot and that sort of thing. So Bob played in all those community orchestras at the time, and he saw me playing this cornetto and said, "Oh, hey, I have this early music group I play with," because he plays Serpent. Why don't you come play with us? And so I got on the phone with the woman who ran that group, and she said, "Oh, do you play recorder?" And I remembered back to second grade and said, "Why, yes, I do. I do play recorder." So I ordered a nice wooden recorder and started practicing on that. And that was a fun group to play with. But I kind of got to know Bob better than I had known him, and he said, "Well, gee, I have this quintaclave. Do you want to borrow it, and then you can come play with us on quintaclave?" And if you don't know what a quintaclave is, it is an alto ophicleide. It's in E flat or F, although I've never seen an F. All the ones I've seen are E flat, but it's probably one of the most rare brass instruments you could possibly look for. I've seen maybe 2 of them for sale my entire life. I've seen available for sale. So I've seen more sudraphones for sale than I have seen quintaclaves for sale. And so he lent me this beautiful instrument, and we would have a quartet we'd play. Now, Bob would play bass ophicleide, and I would play quintaclave. And Bob had a friend who had a E-flat keyed bugle and a B-flat keyed bugle. So we went through a few different people who were playing the B-flat keyed bugle. We were just sort of trying to figure out how to play these instruments, especially the keyed bugle players, because that's not an easy instrument to play. And that's not a particularly historic ensemble either. You don't find much music that was for a quartet of keyed instruments. So we just arranged whatever we could find, and or put choral scores in front of us and did the transposition or whatever, just to have something to play, and it was fun. But I really took to this quintaclave, and I really enjoyed playing it, and I got really good at it.
So would you say that quintaclave was then your first gateway into actually playing a historical specific brass instrument?
Well, cornetto is a brass instrument, but it's not sort of one of the traditional. Quintaclave was my first gateway into playing a brass instrument. Right. Because brass instrument means lip reed, right? Most of them are made of brass, but it doesn't necessarily mean they have to be made of brass. So from there I met the people who were at that point running the Washington Cornet and Sackbut Ensemble. Michael Holmes is a fantastic musician. Sackbut player, cornetto player, plays everything really. I think he's originally a horn player, and as we know from your previous episodes, Michael O'Connor founded the Washington Cornet and Sackbut Ensemble, and when he moved out of the D.C. area, he kind of left that group in the hands of Michael Holmes. So I started going to their concerts and kind of just sort of hanging around and saying, "Oh yeah, I play cornetto too." And lo and behold, one day they actually let me play in a concert. And
Nice.
and probably one of the most terrifying things I've ever done is play cornetto in a concert with people in front of me, because as a low brass player, that is a very, very difficult instrument to play. I could make it sound decent if I practiced it alone for about 2 weeks straight. And then I do, one day doing something else, and then it's all gone. I got to start over again. So I started hanging out with them, and eventually I went and bought my own sack butts and became a regular member of that group. And that's something I really enjoy. It's a fantastic group. So that was kind of my main entry into the world of early brass. But then Michael Holmes, who was the director of the Washington Cornet and Sackbut Ensemble, said, "Oh, hey, you play valves, right?" And I said, "Yeah, started on euphonium." And he said, "I'm going to introduce you to my friend Mike O'Connor, who's got this group, Newberry's Victorian Cornet Band. They need somebody." And so I talked to Mike O'Connor, and he said, we're going to the Vintage Band Festival in Minnesota, and we're going to play as Newberry's Victorian Cornet Band, and we want you to play tenor horn. For people who are familiar with your podcast, they know that tenor horn is a B-flat 9-foot instrument. In modern parlance, the British nomenclature, tenor horn is a E-flat instrument.
Yeah.
It's what we call alto horn in the U.S. And so we went and did several days of rehearsing, and then went to the Vintage Band Festival in Northfield, Minnesota, and played as Newberry's Victorian Cornet Band. And I just loved it. It was fantastic. The music is really, really cool. The instruments are fun to play. And so then I was a member of the Newberry's Victorian Cornet Band from that point forward, I guess.
And you were featured as a soloist on their first recording, right? What were you playing?
Sure. Well, it's a opera aria from Franz von Suppé from an opera called Fatinitsa. And from what I can gather, the opera is about a Russian soldier who dresses up like a woman, and then the general falls in love with him. And
All right.
okay, there's a big love triangle from there and everything like that. And the name of the piece is My Native Land. And I think I went to IMDb or IMSLP and tried to figure out where in the opera this falls and what's happening, and I couldn't find it. It's not in the score for the opera. So I think it might have been one of those numbers that was inserted into the opera at some point later. Mm-hmm. Michael got the music from the Library of Congress. There's a band arrangement there, and there's also a piano arrangement of it.
Okay.
And it quite clearly on the music that's in the Library of Congress says, from the opera Fatinitsa, Franz von Suppé, but it's not in the score for the opera. So it's basically one of the characters singing about his home, right? Mm-hmm. And the tune has also been used as sort of a patriotic song in Austria. It's called O du mein Österreich. And it's kind of a slow tune, and so I added a few little ornaments here and there. But
you were playing it as a vocal, like off of a vocal score of it, or this was written?
No, it's a band arrangement that Michael got from the Library of Congress. So it was a 19th century band arrangement that they actually played back then.
Awesome.
And so it was an actual baritone solo. And so I'm playing that on the 1900 Boston baritone that I got from Michael, who got it from Eric Topman, and subsequently put thousands and thousands of dollars into making it like a new instrument. But yeah, it's a beautiful little piece, and I'm trying to impart upon it some of those 19th century ideas about phrasing and things like that. But mostly I'm going, please don't make these G's be too flat. Because like we mentioned, those 19th century instruments, they're lovely playing instruments. They're really sweet in ways that modern instruments can't be. But the intonation is the one thing that they really hadn't quite figured out yet.
Yeah.
And so it's a really neat little piece. Now, most of that album is music from Thomas Coates, who you talked to Michael about, who's a really cool composer. But that's a nice little interlude on that CD of just some beautiful music, and the band, of course, everybody in that band is fantastic. They did a great job with it. So I'm really happy to have had the opportunity to do it.
Did you get a chance to play that solo in a live performance by any chance?
Yeah, so we recorded that CD at a church in Alexandria, Virginia, and we kind of took over the church for a week and set up all the microphones, and they had a fantastic producer and engineer come in and help with that. And as kind of a thanks to the church, we played the whole program live for them at the end of the week for the members of the church there. So, and that's on YouTube actually. Elisa Kohler, who is now the conductor of Newberry's Victorian Cornet Band, for that project was the solo cornet player. She videoed all those, and that entire concert's on YouTube in one form or another. So that was a lot of fun. And at the more recent Vintage Band Festival, Michael asked me to play a solo again, and I did a solo called the Young America Polka. And was just all triple tonguing. And I mentioned before how, one of the things I enjoy is growing as a player and just learning the stuff that I'm not good at. And, I've always had trouble with articulation. So he sent me a few scores and said, which of these are you interested in doing? I looked at the one that I can't possibly do this because it's triple tonguing at super fast speeds for 2 minutes straight. And I said, that's going to be the one. Let's do that one.
Yeah. Awesome.
Like I said, it's amazing how that practice thing actually works. And
yeah. Who would have thought? That's awesome.
Yeah.
Cool.
So, the My Native Land, though, funny enough, there's an album from 1974 that the wind section of the Berlin Philharmonic did of 19th century Prussian and Austrian marches. And it's a famous album. It's a double CD now. But I was listening to that, and like the second track on that is that tune made into a march.
Oh wow!
So like I said, it's been sort of made into a patriotic song in Austria. And so there's a march, rather than it's bum bum ba ba bum ba da da. Nice. So I kind of put that on when I got that. I was like, wait a second, I know that song.
Yeah. That's awesome. That's really cool. Had you heard any of that type of music before sitting in with them for the first time?
I don't think so. Like I said, I was never a big band music person. I was always more interested in orchestra.
Yeah, and it seems like up until the time you started playing with the Newberry group, you were kind of on the earlier side as far as the repertoire goes.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah.
So O'Connor kind of pushed you back about 200 years into your brass playing.
Yeah. Well, historically informed performance has long been sort of Baroque music and Renaissance music. And especially in Europe, more recently, people are starting to get into classical and romantic music and on original instruments. And it really is something special. There's not a whole lot of it happening in the U.S. I was lucky enough to play in a group based on Mike O'Connor's recommendation. He recommended me in Boston. There was an orchestra called Grand Harmony, which was doing romantic orchestra stuff on period instruments, and they had me up to play Ophicleide, doing the whole Mendelssohn Midsummer Night's Dream suite, and that was really, really cool. It's a little bit unnerving playing Ophicleide in an orchestra like that, because you have all these string players who are all Juilliard people and have beautiful instruments, and all these wind players who are just amazing and can make the most beautiful sounds out of your instrument. And there I am honking along on Ophicleide, making burp noises,
Yeah, seriously.
But that's what the instrument is. It was meant to be like that. It's meant to add a little bit of edge and a little bit of buzz to that orchestra, and it really works. And that's what you're missing when you play that repertoire on tuba or euphonium, as is sometimes done. It just doesn't have that buzziness that the composers knew what they were getting when they wrote that stuff. So that's a lot of fun.
My fiance, a flute player, and her mother would probably 100% agree that the brass instruments are adding burping noises into a beautiful sounding orchestra. That was very accurate to what I think they would say as well.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Now, the reason why we use the term historically informed these days is because we don't know exactly what it sounded like, right? This is the domain of musicologists who go back and read the treatises in the original Italian and try to figure out, what these players did and how it worked. But you can learn a lot just from the instruments, So if you have an instrument that's an original 19th century instrument, or if you have an instrument that's patterned very closely after an original 17th century trombone, just the way it plays can tell you a lot about the way the players would have used it. There are certain things that work and there are certain things that don't work, and the instrument kind of tells you how it wants to be played.
Going back to when you were playing in Michael O'Connor's group with Newberry for the first time, you were saying how you had only recently, I guess, begun acquiring like sackbuts around that time. So when you were playing with Newberry, were you borrowing an instrument from O'Connor, or did you go out and get an instrument just for that ensemble also? Yeah,
so the first time I played with Newberry's, I played tenor horn. And Michael supplied me with a Champion silver piston B-flat tenor horn. And Champion silver piston was basically an imprint of Lyon & Healy in Chicago. Of course, Lyon & Healy makes harps and things like that still today. But at the time, they were a big music store, and they bought instruments from what today would be the Czech Republic, and put their name on it. And so he has one of those, and I find that the earlier instruments are better playing instruments than the late 19th century instruments. They kind of lost something when they started switching over to piston valve instruments at the end of the 19th century. But it was a fun instrument to play, and if you just pick it up and try to play it like a modern euphonium or something like that, it's going to sound terrible. But the instrument has something to teach you, and if you sit down with it and try to figure out how it works, you can actually make it sound really cool. But yeah, so I borrowed that instrument, and I arrived and I played that. We had a great time. And that was the 2010 Vintage Band Festival in Northfield, Minnesota. But a gentleman named Paul Niemisto set up this Vintage Band Festival, and basically bands from all over the world come in. And the vintage part is partly that the festival is kind of an old time festival, and they have modern concert bands and brass bands, and there's a modern brass quintet that's sort of in residence there every time. But there's a lot of bands that are doing the reenactment thing. The Dodworth Saxhorn Band has been there out of Michigan, and the First Brigade Band from Wisconsin, and of course Federal City Brass Band has been there, and the Newberry's Victorian Cornet Band, I think, has been every time they've had one of the big every 3-year vintage band festivals, and it's a really, really cool event. And Northfield, Minnesota is a very 19th century kind of town. Northfield, there's two colleges there. And I don't even remember the names of them. I'm sure somebody could figure it out quite easily. But so it's kind of a college town, but it also is like little small town America, perfect encapsulation of that Midwestern 19th century town. Yeah. And actually, Northfield is famous because in the late 1860s, Jesse James came and tried to rob the bank there, and failed. I think the bank teller said no, yep. and they didn't know what to do, and some shooting happened, and that was kind of the beginning of the end for the James gang, right? Yeah. They all split up, and some of his gang was captured. I think it took a few more years before Jesse James himself was captured, but it's. And I'm not a huge history nerd or anything like that, but it's so romantic. This little town where all these things happened in the 1870s and 1860s, and the buildings are all the same. And now it might be a frozen yogurt shop or whatever, but this is that old 19th century building, and it's really, really cool. So it's neat to be there for a few days and put on something that approximates what they would have worn, and get in a big circle in the park and play the music, the way that a band concert would have happened in the 19th century.
Yeah, right. For sure. That applies to both that town in Minnesota, but then also the Civil War brass bands playing like in the field in reenactments and stuff. We're referencing Michael O'Connor a lot in this episode, but in his episode he was talking about when he was playing with I think it was the 26th Impression. As opposed to Federal City, but they were out in the field playing and saying how reenactors were coming over and saying how much more authentic they've made the experience of reenacting, I think, Gettysburg that time. So just being having the instruments, the uniforms, and then being, where it happened, kind of thing, similar to what you were talking about in Minnesota. It adds a lot.
It does. Now, I'm not big into the reenacting thing. I went and bought the uniform, and I got a nice one because I wanted to do it right, and that's who I am. But but I don't like camping. I don't like being outside. I certainly don't like being outside in the summer in a wool dress dress.
Oh, yeah. It's rough.
And bugs and the food and I need a certain level of privacy with the bathroom. All those things. That's not for me. So I'll do Civil War events where it's a ceremony at the in the middle of downtown Rockville or something like that. But but I'm not so into let's go camp at Appomattox for 3 days and live in a tent. That's no, that's not for me. I like the music. The history's exciting to me, but it's not that exciting.
So that's another draw then to the post-Civil War brass bands.
Right? Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So you've played with Newberry's. Were you involved with Michael O'Connor's Civil War band, the Coates Brass Band as well?
Yeah. So I'm on that record. So I think we did that Coates Brass Band record in 2011. If I'm remembering correctly, we did that shortly after the first Vintage Band Festival, and while the first time I played with Newberry's, I played tenor. Mike kind of came to me and said, "Hey, you're pretty good. Let's upgrade you to baritone, and you and I can kind of switch off and play baritone and B flat bass." And if you don't know, B flat bass is kind of like the tuba part, the E flat bass part. So the B flat bass part is usually not all that exciting, and the baritone part is really exciting, right? That's the lower solo instrument.
Yeah.
So Michael and I would switch off. If you look at the manufacturer's catalogs for instruments, they did sell a separate B flat bass and baritone, but it's debatable how much different those instruments actually were. Yeah. And sometimes the pictures in catalogs are a little bit misleading, and I think the general thought is B flat bass and baritone, aka what became euphonium, is really the same instrument. And later on, you see there are some B flat basses that have really, really big bells, like even bigger than a modern euphonium. But I think in the 1860s and 1870s, maybe the B flat bass player had a fourth valve, but maybe not. It wasn't a big deal if he didn't, and
Mm-hmm.
maybe they left out the baritone part altogether, or it depended on the chart, and they went to whatever they wanted to play.
So was Michael O'Connor's two groups the extent of your? Not that that's not significant, like sufficient, but is that the extent of your early American brass band involvement and experience playing in those two groups?
Well, Yari Villanueva, who you had on, has also called me on occasion to come in and play with the Federal City Brass Band and the 26th North Carolina group. So I've done that a few times. I wouldn't say I'm kind of a regular member of his band.
Gotcha. So the first time you played with Newberry's, you borrowed the horn from Michael O'Connor. At what point did you start kind of amassing your mid to late 19th century arsenal of brass instruments?
Yeah, these instruments are not easy to find. Mm-hmm. They don't show up every day on eBay. There's a lot more cornets than there are baritones and tubas. And, I have a theory about that too. There were a lot of brass drives for World War I and World War II to make cartridge brass. And I think a lot of these instruments just sort of ended up in the dumpster because they were big. They took up a lot of space. And the cornets, Grandpa's cornet was easier to leave in the closet just because it took up less space. And the larger instruments, there are just so many fewer of them around. What I figured out was that the 1870s instruments are practically the same instruments as the 1860s instruments. Mm-hmm. And they're a lot cheaper just because, nobody's carrying it around saying this was played at Antietam or anything like that,
true.
Right. So I started finding a few of the 1870s instruments, and I think the first one I bought was a Boston tenor horn. Actually, I had bought a Pepper from 1870s, a Pepper baritone, and I traded that with Michael O'Connor after the 2013 Vintage Band Festival. So we did the 2013 Vintage Band Festival, and for that I used Henry Diston, Philadelphia baritone that belonged to Steve Lundahl. I had this Pepper, and I had it with me, but it was a little earlier because Newberry's is sort of nominally we play stuff in Newberry's from the end of the Civil War up to the advent of the Sousa Band, right? Mm-hmm. That's the tagline: end of the Civil War to the advent of the Sousa Band. So
1882, then.
Right. Yeah. But really, it's an 1880s kind of band, right? Mm-hmm. And so that 1870s Pepper baritone I had bought wasn't quite the right instrument. So I was using this Diston baritone, gorgeous instrument. Funny story about that too, though. Steve Lundahl, fantastic trombone player, multi-instrumentalist, has a beautiful collection, including some Adolph Sax instruments. Let me use this instrument, but he's a trombone player and doesn't really understand the care of valve instruments. Mm-hmm. So I'm staying with my dad, who played clarinet in Newberry's Victorian Cornet Band, in this dorm room in the college in Northfield, Minnesota. And, we just played a thing, and I'd done a solo in that concert, and I said, you know what, the valves on this are terrible. I need to take this apart and do the full clean out. And I started cleaning it out and scrubbing out the valves and everything like that. And these cork, we use felts in brass instruments these days to space out and mm-hmm. kind of provide damping so that you don't just get metal on metal sounds when you're using the valves. Right. These original corks from the 19th century just started falling apart as I'm trying to wash these pistons. Now, I'm being extremely gentle and stuff like that, but these have been in there for well over 100 years, and they just weren't having it anymore. Yeah. So I had to improvise and make new felts out of little bits of college towels to make the instrument work. And luckily, a little bit later that week, there was a brass repair person who was kind of hanging out. And I said, do you have any felts? And we kind of looked at the instrument and figured out what it needed exactly in terms of spacing and put some modern felts in there. But that's, yeah, you got to be careful with those.
Nerve-wracking, I'm sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So I totally got off on a tangent there, but what I was saying was, after the Vintage Band Festival was over, Mike O'Connor looked at this Pepper baritone that I had and said, that instrument is not a bad Civil War instrument. it's 1870s, but it's got that very tall bell stack, and
Mm-hmm.
it's not out of place. I don't have one like that. Do you want to trade? And Michael had this Boston baritone that he'd been playing that I really liked. I had tried a few times, and it was in those times where we didn't think twice about handing brass instruments back and forth and sharing viruses, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
I tried it and I really liked it, so I said sure, and so I traded. And I think Michael got that instrument from Eric Topman. So that was kind of the first instrument that I really liked that I owned myself was that Boston baritone, which is really shaped very much like a modern euphonium. You know, it's 3-valve instrument, but it's a piston instrument. It's got that kind of squat shape that the modern euphonium has. It's a little bit smaller bell, but for all intents and purposes, it's a modern euphonium.
Yeah.
And that's got a serial number on it, that one. And that one was made in 1900. So it's a little bit later, but it's the same instrument they were making in the 1880s.
Gotcha.
It appears in their 1880s catalog, right? So so
Not updating it a whole lot.
right. Which was kind of the downfall of Boston is they didn't update anything. I can go into Boston if you want to talk about Boston, because I kind of like them. So that was kind of the first one I got, and I kind of said, these Boston instruments are really cool. I like them, and so I started buying more of those. I created a saved search on eBay, and whenever a Boston instrument would come up, I would buy that. So I have several now. I've got a Boston tenor, and I've got a Boston rotary valve baritone from the 1870s that is being restored right now, and I got more recently got a tuba. A nickel silver Boston rotary valve tuba from the 1870s that I haven't had restored yet, and is playable now, but will be a lot better once it gets restored. And I got a couple of Boston trombones. I got a valve trombone and a slide trombone, and I started doing something I hate, which was indulging in collector behavior and getting those just because it worked for me, and I like that. And they're really, really nice instruments.
So your focus is definitely Boston, but what's up with the stigma with the term collector? Why don't you characterize yourself as a Boston instrument collector?
Well, let me put it this way, and nothing against people who are collectors and enjoy that, but. We have a mutual friend who's an awesome, cool guy who has probably, let me put it this way. You can count on one hand the number of E-flat keyed bugles that this particular gentleman doesn't own that are still existing, right? He's got so many of them that he's got more than all the museums put together. And that's collector behavior. He doesn't really play these instruments, but he gets them. And he prizes the instruments that have provenance with them, right? He knows who played them. He's got pictures of them in the 19th century, or their presentation instruments. You know what a presentation instrument is?
Yeah, when it was engraved and given to somebody for a special occasion.
Exactly. The bandmaster of this town retires, and everybody chips in and puts together to order the fanciest instrument out of the catalog, engraved with a special message to him or something like that.
Yeah, exactly.
And those are really cool, and they tend to be really good instruments because when they did something like that, they didn't get the cheap one; they got the good one. They had it engraved, right? Yeah. But I don't have any special interest in the history or. I wouldn't go out and buy a Boston Cornet or a Boston Alto just because I have some other Boston instruments and I want to have the complete set. I don't play those instruments, and when I buy instruments, I buy them because I want them to give me opportunities to play.
Yeah, true.
Yeah.
So I will admit that what I have is a collection, but I always kind of bristle.
He said it.
You heard it here. Yeah.
I always kind of bristle a little bit when somebody calls me a collector because collectors have certain behaviors they do that are awesome things, and it's really cool that they do that, but that's not me. When I buy an instrument, I want to get it because one, I have a gig for it, or two, I want to be prepared when the gig for it comes up. It's not that, look at this amazing piece of history, or I have the rest of the set, so I might as well get this one.
While we're
Go ahead.
while we're talking about instruments, I was wondering if you had a favorite in your arsenal.
I was going to say arsenal.
Yeah, I'll refrain from using the word collection, but do you have a favorite in the group of horns that you own?
No, I don't.
Do you have one that you prefer playing on? If you had a gig where you had multiple options of what you could use for that particular gig, I guess like time period wise or something, do you have a go-to?
No,
What's
really
another way I can phrase the questions that you give us an answer?
Well, I have instruments. I have some that are better players than others, right? It's more fun to play something that plays better than it is to play something that is really out of tune or something like that. I kind of enjoy the challenge of something that I haven't put a whole lot of work into yet, and oh, this gig's coming up, and boy, you haven't played baritone saxhorn in years, so here's a great opportunity to put in some time. And you know what, that practice thing that everyone talks about really works, and it's amazing. It never ceases to amaze me that when you sit down and do methodical work with those instruments, you can get really, really good with them. Even if it's a instrument from the 19th century that just doesn't play as well as a modern instrument, you can get really, really, really good. So I kind of enjoy the opportunities to have a challenge, something that I haven't done before, or something that I'm not as good at and want to get good at. It always feels a little bit dangerous to me, like you're going into this orchestra situation and you really don't know these awful Clyde fingerings that well. And that's exciting to me, where you put in all this practice, but there's still this little bit of edge there where anything could happen. And maybe that's not healthy, but it's fun, Yeah.
Something that you mentioned about the practice is kind of interesting. While I'm doing reading, about all these different bands and different virtuoso players and stuff, they refer to, especially different cornet players, keyed bugle players, as being virtuosos and being able to play anything on the instrument. And then like kind of, I don't know, it might be a bad admission, but kind of in the back of my mind, kind of like the instrument was around for 5 years, like, virtuoso, but like in quotes, like what does that really mean? But then it's exactly what you're saying. Once you get your hands on these things, you're able to see, what the instrument can do, how good you can get at it by practicing. And it's not an exaggeration. Well, maybe to a certain extent, we're not
sure. Well, I mean, like I said, I'm not a musicologist. I haven't done a doctorate in this or anything, but I keep my ear to the ground. And in some cases, you need to do some reading because you want to figure out what the right tool for the job is, right? You need to go to some primary sources just to figure out what instrument to show up at the gig with. But my sense is that these people in the 19th century were actually quite good players. Mm-hmm. And we have this sense that, this music, for the most part, is very simple. But I think that they really cared, and they really did a good job with performing this music. Now, there's an asterisk on that, because if you go back and you look at, a recording of the New York Philharmonic from the 1960s, it's not to the same standard as today's music, right? So, they had instruments where the acoustics weren't really well understood, so there were intonation problems. But other than that, the instruments played really well. And I think they did their best to work against those problems, but I think they probably were excellent musicians. They knew what they were doing. Even the guys who were, members of the town band, and that was their only exposure. They didn't go to New York City and study to become an amazing saxhorn player. Their father handed them the instrument and said, "Here, come to band practice with me." But
tailors and blacksmiths and stuff.
Exactly. But the sense I get is that they cared, and that they put a lot of pride into the level of craftsmanship with what they could do with their instrument, and that they probably were quite good.
Your kind of philosophy is, if I'm going to acquire an instrument, it's going to be because I want to play it. I want to have an opportunity to play it and breathe some music through one that maybe hasn't been used quite recently. But then there are also these great museums of instruments that serve as a resource. And you've visited a few of these, right?
Oh, yeah, more than a few. So my wife loves to travel, so I do that with her. And, I realized early on that while we're doing this traveling, I could go and visit the modern instrument makers and see what they're doing and see how the instruments are made. Mm-hmm. And I kind of got really into just, seeing how instruments are made and how that craftsmanship is done and the tools and techniques they use. And, I've basically been to all the big brass instrument factories around the world. I mean, not like the really big ones in China these days, but I've been to the big legacy manufacturers in Europe and the ones in Elkhart and all those manufacturers and seeing how they do it. It's just fun, sort of seeing how these things are put together. And as an extension of that, I started looking at the old instruments in museums and something that Adolph Sachs worked on himself and just looking at all the little details and the things that you can't see in a picture in a book or on a website. If you stick your head up to the display case and you're 6 inches away from this, there are all these little details and they're so beautifully made. So it's a lot of fun to do that.
What are some of the international museums that you've visited?
Well, the Musical Instrument Museum in Brussels I've been to several times, and recently I got a little bit of a behind the scenes tour there.
Yeah, I saw you posting pictures on Facebook about that. Could you share that experience and maybe how that came about a little bit?
Sure,
if you're allowed.
Yeah, no. Well, they don't just let anybody in to the behind the scenes of those museums. So definitely they wouldn't let me in, but I was hanging out with somebody who had legitimate research he was doing there. Mm-hmm. I mentioned the orchestra Grand Harmony that I had the opportunity to play Ophicleide in, and Serpent in their brass ensemble. And there's a newer group called Teatro Nuovo, which is a lot of the people from Grand Harmony, but it's run by an amazing conductor named Will Crutchfield, who really understands. He's gone back and listened to a lot of the recordings of 19th century opera, the very early recordings, and figured out how they do this opera singing. So this group is I was lucky enough to be asked to play in this opera orchestra, and year before last we did an opera called Medea in Corinto by Meyer, and I got to play Serpent on that. And it was made clear that I'd be asked back the next year, and we're not quite sure what the repertoire is yet. So just have the right instruments. And 19th century Italian opera, there's a lot of different instruments that you could use. Mm-hmm. And so I kind of said, well, gee, if you get the email that we're going to do this opera this summer, and you're just starting to look for the right instrument to do that at that point, that's going to be too late, right? Because mm-hmm. it takes time for somebody to make an instrument, or these things might come up on eBay or an auction house or something like that once every few years. So you have to be prepared with the right instrument for the job. So I figured out that for a lot of Italian opera, I was going to need a bass horn. Mm. And the bass horn is kind of the missing link between a Serpent and an Ophicleide. Okay. Mm-hmm. It's more of a Serpent. It's made of wood, but it's got some metal parts. It's got like a metal bell on it, and it's got finger holes and maybe a few keys. But it's shaped more like an Ophicleide. It's got that bassoon shape. It's made more like a bassoon. It's
like an upright serpent kind of thing.
Exactly. And there are a lot of different names for bass horns in the 19th century. And there was a lot of different stuff tried. The 19th century was like this big laboratory for brass instrument experimentation. And there were and this is one of the other things that's fun about going to museums, is there were so many different things they tried and abandoned, and a lot of them are really quite strange, that it's just neat to see them and look at how they did things. Mm-hmm. So my luthier, who I had make a bass horn for me, is Pierre Ribot, who's one of the best Serpent makers currently. He is probably the only person at the moment who can make you a bass horn. So if you can't find an original, or you don't want to deal with an original and patching up all the rotting wood and all that that plagues some of those originals, He's the guy that can make you one. So I sent him an email and said, I'd like you to make me a bass horn. And then he finished it several months later. Actually, I think it was over a year later, and said, okay, how do you want to ship this? And I said, well, the easiest thing might be just for me to come to Belgium, because he's in Brussels, and pick it up. And he said, great, I'll make you a case. And so I showed up just this past February in Brussels, and he said, oh, well, I've got some business at the Musical Instrument Museum, and that's probably one of the best musical instrument museums in the world, one in Brussels. And would you like to come along with me and check it out? So he was measuring some original bass horns there. Nice. That they have, because he's wants to refine his design and make it even better. And if you've got legitimate research business, then museums tend to let you in to look at these things and maybe even play a note or two on them. Usually not, but sometimes, So it was absolutely amazing. The museum in Brussels probably has more instruments in the storage room in the back than they actually have on display. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And they've got some of the Adolphe Sax 7-belled sax horns and that sort of thing. Sax was a craftsman, and he had a small little shop, and he turned them out, but there were big factories too, companies like Gautreaux and things like that, which could make a lot more instruments than he could, and started doing it. And I think Sax was annoyed that hey, these are my patents, even though maybe he didn't do all that much as far as innovating. It's still that rubbed him the wrong way. Mm-hmm. And so the later sax horns, the sax horn nouveau, he started doing the bell front thing, kind of like the 20th century bell front American baritones, the recording tubas and things like that. Yeah. And he started doing things with this 6-valve system that persisted on French quote unquote sax horns into the 20th century, and things like the French tuba. Mm-hmm. And he started, putting a tuning slide in the lead pipe, which was completely contradictory to his original thought of making a lead pipe that was straight and as short as possible. Mm-hmm. So, my thought is, and it's fun to try to get in these guys' heads and figure out what they were thinking, and I might be completely wrong, but
sounds good to me.
You read enough about it, you kind of get a sense for who they were and what they were trying to do, and so nobody go and write anything official based on my thoughts or anything like that. But
it makes logical sense, and
well, and you can get in trouble that way because sometimes you try to put a easy, convenient button on something and say this must have been what happened, and then later on you figure out that reality was quite a bit more complicated than the way you thought it was. But
yeah, definitely.
And I'm not a musicologist. My father-in-law is a musicologist. I'm friends with a lot of musicologists, so I have a lot of respect for what they do. But I'm an amateur, I just sort of I keep my ear to the ground. I listen to what these guys say. I listen to the way that the experts play, and I try to copy the way they play. Mm-hmm. But I'm not spending time in the library for the most part, trying to figure out some new thing that nobody else has figured out before.
Yeah, for sure.
My knowledge is all second generation, and that's not to say that my dad knew anything about early American brass bands. It's that I learned everything I know from somebody else who did the work to learn it.
Right.
But Boston is a really cool example. And I mentioned before that I've got several Boston instruments and I really like them.
But you don't have a favorite.
No. Well, I don't have a particular one favorite Boston instrument, but they're all really good.
Yeah.
Before the Civil War, two of the very best American brass instrument makers were Samuel Graves and Elbridge Wright, who traded as E.G. Wright. And Graves was from New Hampshire and made the very best, most beautifully decorated, keyed bugles of the kind of the early 19th century in the U.S. Mm-hmm. And I think Wright worked for Graves, and he was kind of Graves' apprentice, and then Wright moved to Boston, and Graves didn't make too many sax horns. I think there were a few. I think Graves also made some clarinets, but he's really known for those keyed bugles. And Wright moved to Boston and started making sax horns, and the Wright instruments are some of the very, very best Civil War era instruments. They're really smartly designed and well put together and very high quality. Mm-hmm. And after the Civil War, I believe that Graves came and kind of moved into a corner of Wright's factory in Boston. So, you can imagine that, it's kind of like, the old master, we're going to let him get a little corner of the factory. He can still put out a few instruments and that sort of thing.
Yeah, yeah.
And in 1869, some of Wright's employees at E.G. Wright basically bought out the company. And I'm not sure exactly how it went down, but I have a feeling that at some point the employees kind of made some investment in the 1869 catalog. They are described as the practical partners of Wright. And they go, it says something like, these men of great experience and talent were the practical partners in E.G. Wright. And they basically bought out Wright. They together with Graves's sons bought out Wright and Graves and combined them into one company, and that became the Boston Musical Instrument Manufactory. And I've actually got a T-shirt on here. I don't know if you guys can see it. I've got a Boston Musical Instrument Manufactory T-shirt that I had made up, and
nice.
And these men were the craftsmen at Wright that became Boston. They became the heart of Boston. It was Henry Esbach, Louis Hartman, and William Reed were their names. And I think Esbach was really the kind of the master craftsman who was doing most of the actual building of instruments at E.G. Wright by 1869. And what happened was Wright himself was not super jazzed about this arrangement and left the company shortly after. And he went across the street in Boston to another maker called Hall and Quimby, which was another very top of the line Boston maker. So that became for like a year Hall, Quimby, and Wright. But then what was the E.G. Wright company became the Boston Musical Instrument Manufactory. And they were making all the same instruments that E.G. Wright had made. In fact, I have a friend who has an E.G. Wright baritone from the Civil War era, and it is absolutely identical to the Boston baritone that I have. Every little detail is exactly the same except the engraving.
Gotcha. Interesting.
So, anything that says Boston on it is at least 1869. So that's one of the reasons I know that in the early 1870s they were making the same instruments, at least some of the same instruments that they were making in the Civil War. Mm-hmm. And the over-the-shoulder instruments still are in that 1869 Boston catalog. Now, Boston, was really then Esbach's company, and Esbach was the genius instrument maker. And he really designed the very first really good piston American cornet. That was the Boston 2-star, and then later the Boston 3-star cornet. And that was sort of patterned after the good French cornets, the Courtois and F. Besson cornets that were being made in the late 19th century. But he did some real development of his own, and that was kind of the first cornet that was a decent American cornet. And in fact, Herbert L. Clark's first professional instrument was a Boston 3-star cornet.
Oh, nice.
Now he's famous for playing other brands of instruments later in his career, but that was his first professional instrument that he bought himself. And the Kahn Wonder Cornet, which came out I think in the late 1880s, is a pretty, and that's the instrument that made Kahn's name, that made Kahn the juggernaut that it is, was the Kahn Wonder, right? Mm-hmm. That was a pretty literal copy of the Boston. So Boston has this place in American music history that's big,
Yeah.
They were really high quality maker at that point. Now, what ended up happening is all the original partners in Boston started dying, and
as what tends to happen.
Yeah. And they just didn't update their line, right? So as the 1910s and 1920s came, Boston was still selling the same instruments that they were selling in the 1890s, and that just wasn't cutting it anymore, because while an 1860 and an 1880 instrument, there isn't much space between there. They very shortly started to figure out this acoustics thing and how it worked. Yeah. And so while in the 1880s it was trial and error, in the 1910s they had some intuition about how if we make this taper here, it's going to fix the intonation and that partial, and
figured some stuff out.
And they might have even known some of the math at that point too, right? Mm-hmm. But so by the 1910s and 1920s, they weren't a big power anymore. They hadn't kept up. They hadn't put the investment into making these new designs, and they just sort of they changed the name at one point. Instead of the Boston Musical Instrument Manufactory, it became the Boston Musical Instrument Company. Mm-hmm. But it wasn't a big deal anymore, and eventually they got sold to a music publisher, and it, rather than getting absorbed into another maker or something like that, like a lot of these do, they just sort of petered out, and they don't exist anymore, and they're not they're not really a big part of the 20th century instrument story,
Yeah, true. Makes sense. No, it's interesting, and it shows that the way you speak about it and the knowledge you have makes sense why you're drawn to these instruments also.
Well, I mean, they're good quality instruments, but it's neat to think about these guys, and they had their company, and then their old boss, he went across the street to another company, and and there was some fighting about it, and the Boston advertisements would say, don't fall for those cheap imitations that might have the name Wright on it. We're the company that was formerly E.G. Wright, There was some cattiness there, and it's just kind of fun because these were humans, they were real people, and they had all their drama the same way we did. It's fun to kind of, and like I said, I'm not a big history nerd or anything like that. But it's kind of fun to think about, who these people were and what they did, and a lot of thought has been put into who the players were, and we all know the stories about the great players, but the instrument makers, not a whole lot of people have tried to figure out who were these guys,
Yeah, definitely. And everybody has a story to tell, and it helps inform every aspect of playing, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
So Barry, thank you so much for coming onto the podcast this afternoon. It's been really, really awesome chatting with you and getting to hear your insights of your experience and your opinions. We're wondering, despite the pandemic and all this kind of stuff, people still are trying to work and get things going. So we were wondering, do you have any projects or anything kind of going on with you right now that you want our listeners to know about?
We'll certainly go out and buy the Coates Band CD and the Newberry's Victorian Cornet Band CD. We actually recorded a second Newberry's Victorian Cornet Band CD 2 years ago, and we're still trying to get that out. So your purchase of the original one will help with that, I think. My big passion right now is some friends and I this past November started a new British brass band, modern British brass band in the DC, Northern Virginia area. Stephen, you play with us, and that's been fantastic. You're an amazing player. You sit right next to me in the group.
Yep.
So, like us on Facebook, Brass Band in Northern Virginia. It's not an early American brass band, but it's some amazing playing. Visit our website, brassbandofnorthernvirginia.com, and once we're back up and running, come to our concerts. That would be wonderful.
Cool. All right. Well, thank you so much, Barry. It's been awesome. Great chatting with you. Hopefully we can get you on the podcast another time. I know that there's still more that we could talk about for sure.
I think I've used most of my stories already, but sure, I'd love to. Thank you. Thanks for having me. It's been fun. And I really enjoy listening to the podcast. A lot of great information.
All right. Thank you so much, Barry, for speaking with Stephen and I about all your experiences and travels.
Yeah, definitely great to get the perspective of someone who's actively out doing historically informed performances, and especially someone with as wide array of experiences as Barry. If you like what you're hearing, you can find us online on our website at eabbpodcast.com. There are a bunch of resources up there. There are show notes for each episode. We're also everywhere on social media, so that's Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and especially YouTube. We're really focusing a lot of effort on putting some exclusive content up on our YouTube channel, so it would really help us out if you went over there and subscribed, and that way you can stay up to date on everything we put out.
This episode's featured album is by Newberry's Victorian Cornet Band, Thomas Coates, the father of band music in America. This is the album that was mentioned during the episode where Barry was a featured soloist on the track My Native Land. This was also, if you've heard one of our earlier episodes, one of the groups of Dr. Michael O'Connor. So on our show notes page, we will have a little write-up for this Newberry's Victorian Cornet Band album, as well as where you can purchase it. And fun little recent bit of news, the second album by this band that was also mentioned by Dr. O'Connor on his episode was recently fully funded, so we're looking forward to having that CD go into production, and we'll be sure to keep you guys up to date on when and where the sequel album is available. So again, that is Thomas Coates, the father of band music in America. And we'll see you over on our website at eabbpodcast.com. And thank you very much.